Before we go in and actually look at our specific peak limiters, sonic maximizers, we need to talk about a few technical details involved when you work with a reference track. And if you're trying to match loudness levels, you really do have to work with a reference track. And the first thing you need to be able to do is flip back and forth between the reference and the track that you are preparing to or are in the process of peak limiting. In this case, it's actually very simple, at least in this program, because we are working with the audio file after it's been bounced from the mix. You remember in the last video, I said, maybe you want to do it this way, maybe you don't want to do it this way. And I will talk about a hypothetical situation if you were to do this within the mix session that you're working on. And a lot of working with a reference inside of the same DAW session involves putting nothing on the master track. Now you can get creative and you can set up key commands so that whatever chain you have turns off when the reference is playing and is turned on when the song you're mastering is playing, but that can get awfully confusing, and you always have to worry about those small glitches where maybe it doesn't react quick enough and then out of nowhere you blow your ears off. Because if there's one thing you don't want to do, it's apply the loudness chain to the track you're working on mastering to a reference that has already been mastered. So there are a couple ways we could do it inside of this program. One is using a deactivate method. So you might have the ability to deactivate a track inside of your digital audio workstation. And then if I highlight both of them, I can use that same key command, which in this program is option A, and I can flip back and forth between the two of them. The issue, which I think you can see, is that by deactivating the track, it also deactivates the plugins that are on that track. That's useful when you're saving CPU in a production standpoint, not useful when you want to flip back and forth and immediately try to compare loudness levels, because it's going to take a little bit of time for those to turn back on. So that doesn't necessarily work for us. It can work for us, but it's risky. The better option would be to use and work with the mute command, because when I have this track muted, what you see is that it grays this out here. Okay, but it's really only graying it out at this level, at this final level. When I'm playing back the track, we can see that we have audio coming in. It's going through a few effects that I already have applied. I don't have the final maximizer on there. We'll get to that in the next few videos. But we can see the audio is coming out here, and then it stops it at this point. So this chain is not being turned off. We are just muting it right before we get to the final output level, which is exactly what we want to have happening. So what I need is the ability to basically have one of these muted, the other one unmuted, hit one button, and it switches between the two of those. And in this program, it's really easy to do that. In your program, this may not be possible. And if it isn't possible, you don't have a deactivate option, first of all, definitely do some research on the internet. And you may have to download a specific plugin to do this, or you may just have to kind of get really creative and come up with your own solution, which might involve applying your peak limiting, bouncing a sample of that, and then just easily going in and manually switching between the two. It's a really archaic way of doing it, but it's always possible. You just have to use your mind and get ingenuitive when you have to come up with ingenious solutions. But here we have a very simple solution, which is to just key map this. So I'm going to map this to the X button. I'm going to map this to the X button, and now I can just toggle between the two of them. If for some reason I manually select one of these, they will both go on and off at the same time. So you need to make sure that you have it set up like so. This is definitely possible in Ableton Live, and it's certainly possible inside of this program, Bitwig Studio. Other programs, you may need to do some research or come up with a different solution. The second thing that's important when working with a reference is having some kind of metering. There are tools out there that give you all sorts of numeric values, but I've yet to come across a tool that's more efficient, that's better than just using your ears. If you can compare and say, oh, this sounds perceptually as loud as the other track, that's what you're going for. Numbers are oftentimes deceiving, especially if you have a lot of low end in your track. You might have a really high RMS value, but at the same time, it's not sounding as loud as the reference. And so in this program, these meters more than do the trick. And when we play back, we see that we have two different indicators. These little lines are indicating the peak value, okay? And the blocks, the filled in bits, are indicating the RMS. The RMS is what gives you the perceived loudness. And so we can see that on this track, the RMS is, by modern standards, very, very high. Now, some of that is this particular program, I would say, encourages you to work at a slightly lower level. Just based on how it's set up. You can actually go in here and change the metering type. But this is quite loud. Very rarely is it going down below 8. So that's pretty extreme. And it's not moving all that much. And it's that degree of movement which is determining still how kind of open, how dynamic your track is. Remember, some genres of music work really well being mastered this loud, others do not. And you can see with my example here, this is fluctuating all over the place. And so by adding that final peak limiter, we're going to be basically stopping that and then coming to something that's a little bit closer to what we see here with the reference. So I just like to have something. I don't need anything really fancy, but I do like to do a little bit of a compare and contrast just to know, because normally I'm not, especially music I make for fun, I'm not going to be trying to reach these kind of levels. That's where you need a professional to really squeeze all of the juice out of it, but I can still come up with something relatively close. The last thing we have to talk about is, where do we apply the chain? I already touched on this before, but you apply the mastering chain to the master track, and the issue is when we open up and play that reference, unless we do another fancy kind of key command, which we could do, it adds more headaches though, I think, we're going to be applying that mastering chain, specifically the peak limiting, to a track that's already been mastered. So it's going to sound absolutely terrible. It's going to blow your ears out. And that's something you need to avoid. So as you can already see, I've started with a few effects on here. I'm not going to show them to you because we're focused on specifically the peak limiting, the sonic maximizing. And this allows us to then apply it to the track. This is convenient though, because we've already bounced out the mix from our full session with all of the tracks and all of the panning and all of the additional effects. What do you do in a situation where you don't have the file? You have everything still loaded into the digital audio workstation and you've done your mix like you normally would. Again, in this program, it's actually very easy, because we can imagine that we have a bunch more tracks in here. Okay, we have all of these tracks and we're thinking, well, these are all being sent to the master. They're not being sent anywhere else, so I'd have to apply my mastering a chain here. Well, not necessarily. What you can do, and what I would recommend you do, even if this is in Pro Tools or Logic or whatever, is leave your reference track alone, have that sending to the master, but take everything else and either send it to an auxiliary or just group it all together. Right? If I get creative here, I can take all of these guys, I can group them, and now their output stage is going to this group to master, which is then sending to the master. So I could then go and I could take that chain that I'm working on, and this would be called the full track, right? Learning how to spell would be useful. And I'm now applying my mastering, my peak limiting here, and the reference isn't being touched by it. And then when I go to bounce out the final track, all I have to do is delete that reference, and we're pretty much good to go. So I'd have to go in here and reset my key command and all of that, which I'm not going to deal with. I'll just go and delete it. But that would be the way to set it up and still keep a reference in the session. So I went through that pretty quickly. This is the technical nature of having a reference inside of the session with the track that you are applying that final bit of mastering, that final bit of loudness to. And obviously, if you have any questions, if any of that is a little bit conceptually confusing to you, please do not hesitate to ask. I can walk through this much slower and it would maybe make a little more sense, but I hope that pretty much is going through to you, and that at the very least you've gotten the gist of it. All right, so now that we have all of that technical stuff out of the way, we can jump in and start looking at and experimenting with a few different peak limiters, sonic maximizers, whose job and goal it is to bring up the perceived loudness of our track.